Welcome. We're so excited to host this event, and I'm Carolyn Raffensperger, and I'm going to kick this off first by telling you a little bit about who's here. And I'm going to start by sharing my slides. How many times have I done this? And it seems like it's a new thing every time. And we're going to show us who's here. So you see a bunch of faces on your screen, and we have a remarkable coalition. But we wanted to tell you about who's put this webinar together, who's been doing the organizing around the state of Iowa for the last several months, since June of last year, and then tell you why we're here. So the coalition has 100 Grannies for a Livable Future, Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, Food and Water Watch, Great Plains Action Society, the Sierra Club and the Iowa chapter, the Science and Environmental Health Network, and you. We're so glad to have you all here. So the coalition really came together out of lessons that we learned from the Dakota Access Pipeline. And for those of you who are familiar with that struggle, this is a picture of Dakota Access, the pipeline going in just above the Des Moines River up near Pilot Mound. And this is Vern Johnson's land. As you know, that he contested that pipeline going in, and we organized a lot of direct action and resistance against Dakota Access. And we learned a lot. And we're bringing those lessons here. And so in June, a lot of us found out that they were proposing something called carbon capture and storage, and it's pipelines going through Iowa. And at first blush, that sounded like an interesting thing. Many of us are environmentalists, and we thought, well, if it's supposed to be about climate change, this could be a really great thing. But the more we looked into it, the more it smelled off. So if it smells like a skunk, probably a skunk. And so we're here today to tell you why environmentalists have gathered together with landowners, with our Indigenous allies and colleagues, and others, people who are interested in good government, to tell you why we're opposed to this, why we want you to join in this struggle with us. And you know, the remarkable thing about this particular struggle is that it really does bring together unusual bedfellows. It brings together people across the political spectrum, across many different kinds of issues. And at its root, it's being proposed as something that is supposed to address climate change. And a lot of you will know that we've been involved particularly in working with landowners, because they will only be able to put these pipelines through using eminent domain, where the government grants the right to seize property against the consent, without the consent of the landowner, and give it to this private company to then put this pipeline in and make a profit. So what is carbon capture and storage, and what are these pipelines all about? Carbon capture and storage is a technology that captures carbon dioxide, CO2, from the smokestacks of power plants, ethanol plants, other polluters. And then the CO2 is pressurized until it turns into a supercritical liquid. And then it's sent through a high pressure pipeline, either in this case to Illinois or North Dakota. And then it's pumped about a mile below ground, or it's used for enhanced oil recovery to extract more oil from the earth. And at this point, there are some carbon capture and storage projects going around that are operative in the United States. And about 80% are used to extract more oil. So if that sounds like something that is not a climate solution, you're right. And you're going to hear more about all of this from our other speakers. So one of the things that that cold sort of textbook definition doesn't tell you is that it's really a get rich scheme on the part of corporations using our money, public money, and other people's land to create a vast sewer system for the fossil fuel industry. There are 3 key points about carbon capture and storage. One is that it takes a lot more energy to capture the CO2, pressurize it, and force it through the pipelines than the ethanol plant uses without carbon capture and storage. These are not just your usual CO2, the kind of CO2 that you're exhaling or that we're using in your soda pop. My colleague, Ted and Sherry's and my colleague at the Science and Environmental Health Network says that we need a new cultural understanding of the kind of CO2 that is posing such a threat, especially through climate change. But then that threat is actually magnified with these hazardous liquid pipelines. And the other thing that I want to reinforce is that these corporations who build these pipelines cannot do business without using other people's property, both landowners' land, which they can seize through eminent domain if they are given a permit, and through their publicly funded profits. For instance, the federal tax credit called the 45Q tax credit will provide about 25% of the revenue of one of the Iowa pipeline proposals in this state. And it may provide more, hard to tell. So I just want to give you a quick taste of what the regulatory landscape looks like, at least in Illinois. The pipelines are regulated in Iowa by the Iowa Utilities Board. The CO2 pipelines cross 6 states, the 3 that are proposed in the state of Iowa. All 6 states have different permitting requirements. North Dakota will regulate the deep well injection of the CO2 since it's been granted that authority by US EPA for the pipelines that ship it to North Dakota. The federal government has multiple agencies involved, from the Army Corps of Engineers to the Environmental Protection Agency to the Department of Energy and the IRS. So unlike Dakota Access, which had about 18 agencies regulating it, this has many, many more because the carbon capture component is regulated, the pipelines are regulated, and then either the deep well injection or the enhanced oil recovery are all regulated by a variety of agencies. I want to end with this one slide. You're going to hear about a lot of other, those aspects of the pipeline with our other wonderful speakers. You're in for a treat tonight. But it raises for me the question of what is government for? If Iowa government or the federal government is solely for the benefit of the economy, then we are going to transfer public goods and public money to private corporations. And, you know, I've said last weekend, as a matter of fact, or the weekend before, that when the politicians come to Iowa, they just say jobs, the economy, and ethanol, and we all go, yeah. That's what, like Pavlov's dog salivating at the sound of a bell. And I would submit to you that what we are seeing is a challenge to that idea of government. And that what I think that we need to consider is that government is really for the well-being of its residents. And if we consider that, then we're going to plan projects that benefit the public. We are not going to just hand over private property, public money to pipeline companies in Iowa that will make them rich and will make us poorer. And so we're in for a long struggle. We are making common cause with unusual people in this, and you'll hear about some of that from our next speaker. And I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Jess Mazur, from the Iowa chapter of the Sierra Club, to take it the next phase. And I want to end with this slide, that CO2 is dangerous. Care must be taken to avoid suffocation and asphyxiation, not only of us individually or all living things, but the body politic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. And my name is Jess Mazur, and I work for the Sierra Club Iowa chapter. I'm a lifelong Iowan living in Des Moines. And I'm going to be talking a little bit tonight about what's actually happened in Iowa. What are the three pipelines? Where are they going? Who owns them? So we're going to get pretty Iowa specific here. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Summit pipeline. This is the pipeline that's the farthest along. It was the first to apply, and it's the one that we're hearing the most about right now. So the goal of this project is to capture carbon dioxide or CO2 from ethanol plants and pipe it up to North Dakota to be stored underground. It's owned by Iowa's one and only Bruce Rastetter, who you probably have heard about in the past. And it's supposedly going to be the largest CCS project in the nation. There are 685 miles of pipe in Iowa, and they're going to be collecting carbon dioxide from ethanol and other types of facilities in Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa. So it's a multi-state project. They completed their informational meetings, which is part of the Iowa Utilities Board process, and they filed for their permit in January. So right now, what Summit's trying to do is trying to survey people's land. So they're trespassing on people's land all across the state because they're not doing proper notice. And they're putting a lot of hard pressure sales on landowners all across the state to try to get them to sign away rights to their land. Recently, Summit announced that they have partnered with a coal plant in North Dakota, and a major investor is an oil tycoon, Harold Hamm, which just sends us lots of red flags that this isn't about climate change. It's about making money for people like Bruce Rastetter. Next one is going to be the Navigator pipeline. This is the second one that we heard about in Iowa. It's the second farthest along. It has the same premise. It's going to capture CO2 from ethanol plants, and it pipes it to Illinois to be stored underground. It's owned by Valero, BlackRock, you've probably heard of BlackRock, and Navigator CO2 Ventures. It has 900 miles of pipe in Iowa. It's also multi-state. It's collecting CO2 in Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa. It has completed its informational meetings, and it is slated to file a permit sometime between now and early fall. And they right now are currently trying to survey people's land. We've not heard of them trying to get easements yet, but they are out there trying to look at people's land. The third one is the ADM Wolf. This is one we know the least about because they have not actually officially initiated the process here in Iowa. But their plan is to, again, capture CO2 from ethanol plants and pipes it to Illinois to be stored underground. And it's 150 miles in Iowa. It's owned by ADM and Wolf Carbon Midstream. It's going from Cedar Rapids to Clinton to Decatur, but we're not 100% sure about the route as much as we are with the other two pipelines. This is all we've seen. It's just kind of this thick line. So we're not quite sure who's impacted on this one yet. Their plan is to begin acquiring land sometime this year. And they have been meeting with county supervisors in Lynn, Johnson, Cedar, Scott, and Clinton counties. So we're going to talk a little bit about what this looks like in general. This is what Iowa will look like if these projects are approved. You can see here Summit, Navigator, ADMs would kind of be on in this little area here. And then we've heard rumors of a fourth and a fifth pipeline. So as you can see, this is a chaos web of pipelines that are going across our state. And this, if this industry has its way, is what they forecast us to look like in the long term. There's just lots of carbon pipelines, and you can see all those little dots are where they think they can capture CO2 and ship it somewhere. So we have a lot to protect and fight for right now and make sure that these projects do not go forward in Iowa and beyond. So what is the Iowa process? The very first thing a pipeline company that wants to build a hazardous liquid pipeline, that's what this is classified as, hazardous liquid material pipeline, they have to start out by kind of initiating the process with filing with the Iowa Utilities Board and holding informational meetings. Those have to be held in every county that's impacted. Summit and Navigator have already done that. Once they've completed their informational meetings, they will have to file a petition for their permit. And eventually the Iowa Utilities Board will schedule a public hearing. And then if it is approved, it goes to the right-of-way eminent domain process. We don't expect any public hearings to be scheduled until 2023. So we have the rest of the year to organize and unite and fight back to try to stop these pipelines. And we're going to do everything we can to keep pushing back that timeline so that we have more time to stop the pipelines. And during all of this process, Iowans are getting harassed by the pipeline companies. So we as people who are not landowners need to stand up and help support farmers and landowners across the state for harassment. The local fight back, we have 30 out of 52 impacted counties that have objected. You can see the route, most of the counties on Summits, a lot of them on Navigator, 32 out of 52 total. In other states, they're fighting back as well. Dominant law groups representing landowners in Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota. You can visit the Iowa site at iowaeasement.org. Minnesota is working to get CO2 classified as a hazardous material. South Dakota, it has a precedent-setting number of landowners that are intervening in the process. Nebraska is getting people signed up with the law group. Illinois is fighting back. Illinois and North Dakota are fighting back not only on the pipeline route, but over the sequestration sites as well. And what's our superpower? How are we going to stop these things? It's a united coalition of unlikely allies who are joining together to stop these pipelines. Our group are farmers and landowners and environmentalists and Indigenous people and local governments. We recognize that we're able to look past our differences, and we've discovered that we have a lot in common. We care about our communities, our families, and our land, and we're willing to work together to protect our state. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Julie Dunn, who is going to talk about how this is not a climate change solution.
Thanks, Jess. Hi, I'm Julie Dunn, CCI member from Hardin County, Iowa, home of Bruce Rastetter. Yes, that Bruce Rastetter. I'm a grandmother, a great-grandmother, retired, and I have nothing to lose. My sons, their families, and future families have everything to lose if the country doesn't start dealing realistically with climate change. And that's why I'm here tonight. CO2 pipelines are just a greenwashing tactic. Greenwashing is a marketing tactic aimed at convincing consumers that a company's products and practices are environmentally sound, when in reality, they pollute the environment. You may have seen a PBS Frontline 3-part series, The Power of Big Oil. It examines the fossil fuel industry's history of casting doubt and delaying action on climate change. They have lied for decades, and carbon capture is just another scheme to sustain the unsustainable. Another example of their gross dishonesty from an article published just yesterday in the British newspaper, The Guardian, in an article entitled How the Oil and Gas Industry is Trying to Hold US Public Schools Hostage. A quote from that article concerning New Mexico reads, their latest tactic, to position oil and gas as a patron saint of education. Powerful interest groups have deployed a months-long campaign to depict schools and children's well-being as under threat if government officials infringe upon fossil fuel production. You can't make this stuff up. But back to Iowa. Carbon capture is largely funded by people who want to cash in on it. Bruce Rastetter Summit, Navigator, Wolf ADM, and now news that Rastetter Summit will partner with Minn Kota Power Cooperative to co-develop CO2 storage facilities in North Dakota. What fresh hell is this? Rastetter has never been a climate fighter before this. Why is he interested now? Spoiler, money, but that will be talked about later. On surface level, CO2 pipelines make it look like companies are environmentally friendly, while we are still burning just as much, if not more, dirty fuels like ethanol. On paper, CO2 pipelines look like they will reduce the emissions of ethanol plants because of pollution trading, but that is on paper. It hides behind the slippery concept of net zero, pollution trading, carbon credits, adding money as an incentive to lower emissions. But we've seen this doesn't lower emissions, but people are profiting off this false solution anyway. Carbon capture is a polluting technology because it doesn't reduce air pollutants aside from CO2. And all the others go up because of the fact that you need more energy to run carbon capture equipment, and they have more mining as well. And there's no reason for it except to distract us and waste money, like running on a hamster wheel, but not moving forward. CO2 pipelines are a new unsound technology. One that has been implemented has failed horribly at meeting carbon capture goals. And again, from The Guardian, an article from July 2021 tells of an established project that fails to meet its goals. The article is entitled "A Shocking Failure. Chevron Criticized for Missing Carbon Capture Target at WA Gas Project." This article concerns Chevron Australia's Gorgon plant and shows that it fell short of its 5-year target for burying carbon dioxide under an island off of Western Australia. It has been plagued with problems. Sustainable Energy Now West Australia said that a report to be issued would likely find that the project only captured about 30% of what it was supposed to. And you can find that link in chat. CO2 pipelines prop up dirty, polluting industries. The false solution would allow ethanol companies to gain tax credits for reducing their carbon footprint. But we know that's not what these pipelines will achieve. We also know that some farmers are selling all of their corn crop to ethanol plants. So much for Iowa farmers feeding the world. But farmers need to make a living too. So they need to get the best price. Farmers trapped by markets they don't control, just trying to break even. Enhanced oil recovery. Summit said they would use it, got backlash, and then suddenly said they would not use CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. It makes oil companies richer, damages land, and threatens the safety of rural communities. Summit Pipeline would cement ethanol, dirty ethanol, as a transportation fuel for the next 30 years instead of focusing on real solutions, environmentally sustainable solutions. Wind, solar, hydro, cover crops, prairie restoration, etc., should be our formula for the future. Generating electricity without emissions, using energy more efficiently, using vehicles and equipment powered by electricity and not gas, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Plants and soils already remove and store CO2, and we need to improve land management techniques to take full advantage of that. We could and should be doing all of the above. They're proven to work for reducing and capturing carbon, and they're more cost-effective and easier on the environment. They would create real jobs and sustain communities and the environment for the future. Thank you. And now our next speaker is Dr. Ted Shetler.
Thank you, Julie. I'm going to share my screen here. So hello, everyone. I'm Ted Shetler. I am the Science Director of the Science and Environmental Health Network. My background, training, and experience is in medicine and public health. And I want to just spend a few minutes talking about the public health hazards and risks of carbon capture and storage. And I'm going to address several components of this. I'm going to talk about carbon dioxide capture technologies on ethanol plants, on fertilizer plants, because that's been proposed as well, and then carbon capture in post-combustion fossil fuel energy facilities. Then I'll talk about briefly about concentrated CO2 exposures that could occur during CO2 transport, and finally CO2 sequestration. I want to begin by pointing out that that there are significant energy requirements for carbon capture and storage. The capture and compression and transport and sequestration all require energy, which is added to the baseload requirements of the facility. And if that added energy is generated by natural gas or coal combustion, for example, there will be increased emissions from that energy production. Although, of course, the CO2 would be reduced because it would have been captured. So we need to keep in mind that there will also be increased upstream environmental and health impacts from the extraction, transport of this additional fuel that's being required in order to carry out the carbon capture and storage. If we look specifically at the CO2 capture from a corn ethanol plant, we find that the CO2 that is generated from fermenting corn to make ethanol is wet, and it must be dehydrated for capture and transport. The reason for that is that when CO2 and water are combined, they form carbonic acid, which is highly corrosive in carbon steel pipelines. So it's essential that the CO2 be dehydrated before it is put into a pipeline for transport. Triethylene glycol is a chemical that's commonly used as a drying agent, although there are others. And then that drying agent is regenerated in a distillation process in order so that it can be used again. And that requires heating. And that therefore requires additional energy requirements at the facility. Now, this is a very simplified schematic of the most common process for making nitrogen fertilizer. And in the top panel, you'll see what's called steam methane reformation. And over on the left, you see that natural gas is combined with steam in a reformer, which then goes through a series of chemical transformations to produce carbon dioxide and hydrogen. Those two gases, carbon dioxide and hydrogen, are initially mixed together, and they need to be separated because it's the hydrogen that's more useful, that's being used to make the nitrogen fertilizer. So the carbon dioxide here that I've circled in a red ellipse is what is proposed to be captured and then transported for sequestration. On the bottom panel, you'll see how that hydrogen is used. The hydrogen is combined with nitrogen under high pressure and temperature, and that then results in the formation of liquid ammonia, which is the basis for the nitrogenous fertilizers that are being made. Now, this is all very energy intensive, requiring a considerable amount of energy, both for the ammonia production, but also for the carbon dioxide capture, which is being proposed. I'm mentioning all of this because I have seen that Navigator has actually very publicly said that they're intending to add a large fertilizer plant to their carbon capture operations, which will then be shipped to Illinois, as Jess outlined in her presentation. So if we think about what are the health effects of these of this added energy that's required for the carbon capture, we see that if it's coming from a gas-fired power plant, there will be emissions that are in excess of the base load emissions, including nitrogen oxides, methane, which are both ozone precursors, as well as a contributor to particulate matter in the air. If it comes from a coal-fired power plant, there would be, in addition to those, sulfur dioxides and large numbers of larger amounts of particulate air pollution, as well as mercury and other metals. And the emissions from this energy production is going to fall largely in local communities and the local regions. So there will be that aspect to consider if this extra energy is being used in the carbon capture process. There's one additional hazard that I want to point out that derives from capturing carbon dioxide from the flue gas of a facility that is attempting to capture CO2 from the extra energy that's being burned in that facility. And I'm pointing this out because Navigator has said very publicly in a report that I've seen that they intend to capture both the CO2 that comes off of that fertilizer production of hydrogen that I pointed out on the previous slide, but they also intend to capture the CO2 from the flue gas that results from the extra energy combustion. Now that gas stream, the flue gas, is a complex mixture of gases. It's CO2 plus a number of contaminants. And it's essential that the CO2 be separated from that and isolated, because those contaminants, if they get into the CO2 stream, add to the likelihood that there's going to be further corrosion of the pipelines as the CO2 is being transported. So in light of that, what is done typically is to use solvents to pull out the CO2 from the flue gas. And ethanolamine solvents are what are most commonly used, although there are other alternatives as well. Then the solvent that contains the CO2 is heated, which releases the CO2 and then can be captured. But in the process of heating it, the solvent degrades to some extent, and that needs to be replaced periodically. And then we find that degraded solvent is actually contaminated with a number of hazardous compounds that turn this into a hazardous waste that needs to be disposed of as a hazardous waste. And you can see here, these numbers on the slide show you that this is not a trivial amount, that 1 million metric tons of CO2 captured will generate hundreds to thousands of metric tons of this amine waste, which is contaminated with some of the things I've shown here in the bottom bullet on this slide, including carcinogens and other toxicants that needs to be disposed of either by landfilling or incineration, which are the two most commonly used methods. And so if this were to be deployed in Iowa, one would want to know what the plans are for disposing of this hazardous waste that will be generated. Let me move on now to some comments about the toxicity of carbon dioxide itself. As Carolyn pointed out, the CO2 is compressed into a supercritical liquid, and then it's piped through pipes long distances to the point where it's going to be sequestered. So the risk or the hazard along the way here is that if there were a pipeline leak or a rupture, there would be the release of large amounts of concentrated carbon dioxide. So let me talk a little bit about what the implications of that are. CO2 is heavier than air. It's colorless, it's odorless, does not burn. So if one were caught in a cloud of CO2, you wouldn't be aware of it by a smell or anything that you could see. Because it's heavier than air, it tends to settle to the ground and flow downhill. And in doing that, it displaces oxygen. So in that way, it becomes an asphyxiant. So let me just point out here some of the impacts of increasing levels of exposure to concentrations of CO2. As the concentration increases to just 2% in the ambient air, we begin to see an increase in respiratory rate and breathing, which is an attempt of the body to try to get rid of the excessive amount of CO2 that's being experienced. And this is a very rapid response. If the concentration increases to 4% in the ambient air, this increase in breathing rate becomes very distressing. And now the breathing rate is not able to keep up with it. And you begin to see the developing of an acid response in the blood, just like I described in the pipelines where carbon dioxide and water combine to form carbonic acid. The same thing happens in our body, and we develop an acidosis, which has widespread effects on most all organ systems in our body, including our brain and nervous system. And that level at 4% is considered immediately dangerous to life and health by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, because it not only causes this increased breathing rate and the development of respiratory acidosis, but it also causes confusion and makes it difficult for people to realize what's going on and to get to safety. At slightly higher concentrations, you see here at 5 to 10% concentration, the symptoms become quite severe and can lead to unconsciousness within just a few minutes. And at more than 10%, can cause convulsions and a coma in less than a minute, and death within 10 minutes, and a 20 to 30% loss of consciousness and death within 1 minute. Now, if we think about this and we think about the routing of this pipeline and whether or not it's going to go close to communities, to farms where people are living, and then think about the hazard and risk associated with a pipeline rupture and the amount of time that people would have to respond, you begin to see how this is potentially a high risk along the pipeline, in some places more than others, because there will be people closer by in some places than in others. And then finally, I just want to mention some of the potential risks associated with sequestration. As Carolyn mentioned, the CO2 is proposed to be pumped deep underground, and the sequestration site has to be carefully chosen. It needs to be in geology that will accept the CO2, but it has to be in geology that's separated from drinking water aquifers by a continuous cap rock. So that the CO2 cannot leak out of the sequestration site and get into drinking water that will be brought to the surface for people to use. There are two things to consider. One is that as the CO2 is piped deeply underground beneath a cap rock, if it's not done carefully in the proper geology, or in the proper geology, it can cause the cap rock to fracture, which would allow the CO2 to leak out into a drinking water aquifer that's above it. And it can also, in some parts of the country, cause earthquakes. And that is also going to depend on the geology. For example, a lot of the injecting of CO2 and others, water and other liquids below ground for enhanced oil recovery in Texas and Oklahoma is responsible for large numbers of earthquakes, which have actually limited their ability to do that. But that is really dependent on the geology. If CO2 leaks from underground storage site and gets into a drinking water aquifer, the risk is it will, of course, again, form carbonic acid, but it also then would cause leaching of metals and other hazards, including potentially radionuclides, into that water system, into that aquifer, that which would then be brought to the surface for people to drink. And then, of course, there's finally the concern about surface leaks that could occur through orphan or unidentified wells, or through corroded well casings. And this has actually happened in the past. And if we think about this as being proposed as a way of long-term sequestration of CO2, we have to ask ourselves how capable we are of the long-term monitoring for leaks that may occur. I mean, we're talking about decades and decades. We're talking about hundreds of years of monitoring that would be necessary to make certain that this CO2 that we have paid for with public money to put beneath the surface has not leaked out and missed the whole point. So those are just some brief comments on the potential public health risks, and I will pass it on to Mahmoud.
Thank you, Ted. Right, I'm here today to give you some brief overview on, actually, first of all, I'll go ahead and start out by saying my name is Mahmoud Fitil. I'm coming to you today from the border of Nebraska and Iowa. And we're here to talk about carbon capture and storage and impact to Indigenous peoples and tribal lands. Today is the 5th of May. It's National Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Day. For anybody who is not aware, we're going to go ahead and discuss that a little bit. First off, regarding carbon capture and storage and these pipelines that are proposed for Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Minnesota, history repeats itself as land originally stolen from Indigenous people is at risk, and Indigenous folks are being made to stand in defense of stolen land being taken yet again for settler descendants due to corporate greed and the use of predatory economics. Transient workforce man camps are a particular concern to the indigenous communities that are along the route for these proposed projects. Both Summit and Navigator go from Iowa into Nebraska, where there are several tribes with reservations along the Missouri River. Transient workforce or man camps are contributing to the missing and murdered indigenous relatives MMIR crisis. No more stolen relatives, the human rights violations that take place when man camps pop up during the construction phase of these proposed pipeline projects. You often hear Summit, they tout jobs as one of the main benefits of having these pipelines come through the communities. And sure enough, everybody would like to have great paying jobs in their communities. What they don't tell you is Iowa is already at a shortage for labor, and they would be bringing in largely transient workforce anyhow, just the way it works in the industry through different union contracts and so on, pipe fitters and things like that. They normally come out of Texas or Oklahoma. They're normally previously involved in the petroleum or fossil fuel industry. And yeah, it is an issue. And if you don't think that it won't happen in Iowa, it already has. During the Dakota Access Pipeline installation back in 2016, a good friend of ours actually had their daughter be solicited by a worker as he drove by in his white pickup truck, shouting out the window, "How much for the little girl?" in an October 15th video. It was pretty disgusting to see firsthand that type of behavior, and really eye-opening to some of the things that we hear about and aren't necessarily part of majority or mainstream culture that we should be bringing awareness to. Furthermore, these transient man camps, they're not really good for rural communities either, beyond just tribal nations, sovereign tribal nations and reservations. They do often have a lot of young men who don't have ties to the community. Oftentimes there are issues with drugs and alcohol at these transient workforce camps, AKA man camps. A testament here is in Line 3, a replacement project up in Minnesota, which is actually going to be impacted also by these carbon pipelines. 6 men, including 2 Line 3 workers, were arrested in a human trafficking sting in July of 2021, for example. So there is proof, there is links to this. It's not like we're just making these stories up or anything like that. And as mentioned, these projects are passing by the reservations along the Missouri River. MMIR crisis, I'll give you a bit of an overview today just because it's the National Day of Awareness. Indigenous women and girls are murdered 10 times more than any other ethnicity according to the DOJ. Murder is third leading cause of death for Indigenous women, according to the CDC. At least 4 or 5 Indigenous women will have experienced violence in their lifetime. Over 50% of Indigenous women have experienced sexual violence. Gender-based violence, including sexual assault and physical violence, is committed against 75 to 85% of Indigenous Two-Spirit individuals. Rural, sparsely populated reservation country does not occur in urban environments, and it also does occur in urban environments as well. Due to rural environment, many Indigenous people travel long distances for work or school, or move off reservation for employment and education opportunities where they don't necessarily have a community network. In Nebraska, Native Americans are 1.5% of the total population, but make up 4.6% of all missing persons in the state, or 3.1 times the population in 2021. Not just women, but 73.3% of missing natives in Nebraska are 17 years or older. 17 years old or younger, and they're boys. Complicating factors are relating to these issues and crimes that are committed by some of these camps. Complicating factors are jurisdiction and tribal and non-tribal, state versus federal. Law enforcement on reservations typically falls under the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs. However, there are always exceptions, including so-called checkerboard reservations. The FBI is responsible for investigating the most serious crimes on reservations, with following conditions apply. Investigation must be predicated, that is based on a criminal act, which is the FBI jurisdiction, including crimes the FBI wouldn't have jurisdiction over if they had occurred off reservation. The crime must have occurred with a reservation where the FBI has jurisdiction, and the subject, victim, or both must be Native American or Alaskan Native. Some other issues to consider for rural communities as well as reservations and tribal nations. CO2 is an asphyxiant, as you heard from Dr. Shetler. It's heavier than air, as you heard, and travel long distances as well. I would liken it to some rural communities so they might understand a bit better to an anhydrous leak. It would settle in lower valleys and take a long time to dissipate. If there was a rupture, it would be in a ductile fracture. It would be like a very violent type of a rupture. And there would be shrapnel and things like that. It would be a very chaotic emergency type of thing, which would require emergency responders. The issue here is, well, does the community have first responders? How many emergency vehicles are going to get to the injured folks? Internally combustible engines don't run without oxygen. Will first responders also become victims? And we can ask that about tribal communities. We can ask that also about rural communities where a lot of these types of services are provided by volunteers, like volunteer fire departments. Will tribal communities, emergency services, first responders be able to respond appropriately to an event of a catastrophe? A leak will occur. It's not if, it's when everything mechanical breaks. So that's something that we have to consider. That's something that Summit has to consider, Navigator has to consider. Will rural communities, emergency services, first responders, volunteer or local rural fire departments and emergency responders be trained or specifically outfitted with any type of gear that would work in a catastrophic failure of the pipeline? What role or responsibility does the corporation take for preparing local responders? What do they take in the event of a disaster? These are all questions that are facing tribal communities along the route, as well as rural communities. And these are things that we ask you to consider as well, as we all recall and honor the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives today. I will turn it over to Emma Schmidt of Food and Water Watch, and she's going to be speaking on public money analysis.
I was really hoping that you would introduce me as Cool Stud Emma Mahmood, but I guess I'll take my official title. Like Mahmood said, I am Emma Schmidt. I live up in Calhoun County, and I am a senior organizer for Food and Water Watch. I know you've all heard a lot of compelling information about why these pipelines are a bad deal for Iowans already, but I am here to offer a bit of a deeper dive on one of the reasons that 80% of Iowans are opposed to these projects. And that is the massive, and I mean massive, amount of our tax dollars funding these hazardous carbon pipelines. I don't know about you, but when I file my taxes, I at least like to hope that that money is going to benefit society. I want my taxes to support high quality public education or to help pay for infrastructure upgrades in my community. I really want my tax dollars to mean something, to be used for good. But these carbon pipeline projects are diverting our public money from investments that would serve everyday people like you and me. And instead, our tax dollars are being exploited. Our public money is going directly into the bank accounts of men who are already unimaginably wealthy. And we're talking very substantial sums of money to the tune of $20 billion for the proposed carbon pipelines alone. Now, we know these pipelines are nothing more than a grift, a scam that offers no meaningful improvement to the lives and the well-being of Iowans. But let's just kind of break down where some of this money is coming from. The most talked about funding stream is 45Q. So way back in 2008, Congress added Section 45Q to the tax code to essentially encourage carbon capture technology. Under 45Q, a corporation can earn up to $50 for every ton of carbon they sequester, or they can profit $35 for every ton of carbon that's used for enhanced oil recovery, which Carolyn mentioned. Of the facilities currently operating, all but one use the carbon for enhanced oil recovery. And then this tax credit can be claimed for 12 years as of right now. And of course, there are very real concerns about oversight and the ability of corporations to report fraudulent numbers. But if we assume Summit, Navigator, and ADM Wolf capture and store the amount of carbon that they anticipate, they will receive around $2 billion each year. So if we just kind of put that into perspective, let's pretend that you are the inventor of the everlasting gobstopper, right? Okay, you make $10,000 a day because you are this great inventor. Just a quick disclaimer, to my knowledge at least, neither Willy Wonka or the everlasting gobstopper are real. And based on that chocolate factory, I would guess that Willy was rolling in more than 10K a day, but we're just gonna ignore those minor details. And we are going with the fact that you yourself invented the everlasting gobstopper and you are earning $10,000 per day. If you never spent a single dime of your daily paycheck, it would take you over 500 years to save $2 billion. And these companies are going to rake that much money in every single year from just one single tax credit. And of course, that's not their only funding stream. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act that was passed by Congress last year provides $2.1 billion in loan guarantees for CCS, $1 billion for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in rural areas, $320 million for mapping underground storage areas, $115 million in direct air capture technology, $2.5 billion in CCS research, and another $2.5 billion in pilot projects. And this, of course, is on top of the billions that we've already invested into demo projects and research over the past decade plus. Projects and research that have shown us one single thing: CCS does not work. But okay, maybe you're thinking that's a lot of money on the table, but what about the economic benefits that these projects will bring back to our communities? Summit recently put out an economic analysis, so let's talk about it. The main thing to know about this economic analysis is that it is all based on assumptions. They assume that they'll be granted eminent domain to build the pipeline. They assume they'll operate one of the only financially successful CCS projects, despite the technology repeatedly failing for everyone else. They assume this CCS boom will last for the long term. But even if we play along with all of these conjectures, the economic benefits that they report still fall short. For example, Summit expects to permanently employ 47 full-time staff. And like Mahmoud said, job creation is great. I completely agree, but I'm not sure it's financially sound to invest tens of billions of dollars just for 47 jobs. Summit also claims that the project will bring in millions from property taxes, with places like Sioux County garnering $2.5 million after the project has been completed. Of course, they do fail to mention that counties are going to have a variety of expenses, from the costs that will go into the condemnation process, engineer and zoning board oversight, training for EMS, and so on. The report also does not mention likely losses in agricultural revenue on land surrounding the project. And these losses have occurred following other pipeline projects and affect nearby agriculture through soil damage and soil drainage disruptions. And in that same vein, non-farming landowners will likely experience a fall in their home value if they're near the pipeline or carbon capture facilities. So when you take it all together, there really is no economic benefit to these pipelines, or at least there's no economic benefit so long as you aren't the wealthy CEO of a carbon capture corporation. And as long as we're talking about wealthy CEOs, let's talk about where they are spending their money. I do hope you're sitting down, because I'm sure this one will be a shocker. Surprisingly, they are spending their money on things like buying off our elected officials. For decades now, Bruce Rastetter has been buying off legislators in Des Moines and Washington, D.C. In return for very powerful influence. Over the past 24 years, the Iowa Ethics and Campaign Disclosure Board records show that he's contributed more than $2.6 million to political campaigns, with the bulk of that going to Iowa politicians. He's contributed over $60,000 to Iowa's members of Congress, all of whom have spoken in support of the pipelines. Since 2015, Bruce Rastetter has donated over $163,000 to Kim Reynolds alone. $163,000. He's already put $50,000 towards her re-election campaign. Similarly, he has donated thousands to House Majority Leader Pat Grassley and Senate Majority Leader Jack Whitver's campaigns. Strangely enough, those very same people stepped in and squashed every meaningful piece of legislation introduced to address the carbon pipeline projects this legislative session here in Iowa. And now, Navigator CEO hasn't spent quite such jaw-dropping sums. But for not living in Iowa, their contribution history is rather intriguing, including $2,000 to Jack Whitford's re-election campaign, $2,000 to Pat Grassley, and $1,000 to Kim Reynolds, all in the weeks leading up to the 2022 legislative session. So you can just make of that what you will. I think here the real key takeaway here, though, is that these carbon pipeline projects are a scam. Iowans will not be forced to burden the many risks of these hazardous pipelines. We have seen time and time again that these projects are not profitable. They won't bring meaningful jobs to Iowans or hinder the climate crisis like the industry claims. This is nothing more than a hustle to use our tax dollars to enrich the profits of a couple fat cats and their cronies. So remember, our land, our lives are not for sale. And on that note, I'm going to hand it back over to Jess to tell us exactly how we can fight back against these unproven, unneeded pipeline projects.
Thank you very much, Emma. And like we said when I was on the screen last, what's our superpower? It's our united coalition of unlikely allies joining together to stop the pipelines. Farmers, landowners, environmentalists, Indigenous people, local governments, taxpayers, and beyond. So what are we going to do about it? Got to join the fight. We've got to support the people directly impacted. We've got to support supervisors, and we've got to fight to save our state. So first thing, submit an objection to the Iowa Utilities Board. Objections are important because when the Iowa Utilities Board makes its decision, it's going to look through and see what the people of Iowa think. So add your voice. You can submit an objection by emailing customer@iub.iowa.gov. Second step would be calling your county supervisors and asking them to oppose the projects and to pass an ordinance. And just a reminder, here are the counties that have passed objections so far. And so if your county's red, next step is an ordinance. If your county's not red, we need an objection and an ordinance. Next step that you can do is get involved on social media to help us spread the word and to stay up to date. Our Facebook page for the coalition is called the Carbon Pipeline Resistance Coalition. So just go onto Facebook and search Carbon Pipeline Resistance Coalition and you'll come across our group. Next is a little bit of fun that we're going to have this weekend is Governor Reynolds is opening a new office in West Des Moines, and we happened to find out about it just in time for this webinar, and we thought it would be a good opportunity to go to that office opening and ask her why she's not prioritizing stopping these pipelines and protecting Iowa's land and farmers and all of us Iowans. So that's this Saturday on May 7th. It is, I'll jump back in with the time in a minute. I realize I just left that off the slide. I believe it's at 10:30, but I will jump back in a minute with that. And then lastly is a save the date. We're going to be digging into all the different topics we talked about tonight in future webinars. And one of those we already have on the calendar, and it's going to be a more in-depth analysis of how pipelines impact health and public health. And that'll be on June 2nd, and it's at 6:30 p.m. And when we get that link set up, we will send that around to anyone who's registered for this webinar. So with that, I think we're going to take some question and answer. And Carolyn, do we have any questions from the audience?
I think we do, and one is specifically for you, I think. So there was a question about the fact that Summit only has about 20% of the voluntary easements that it needs for this particular project. What do you have to say about that, and does that matter?
Yes, it does matter. Actually, the easements that anyone signs with these companies are public. You can go to iowalandrecords.com or .org, I forget which one it is, create an account and you can search yourself. And we are monitoring those easements, and Summit is exaggerating a little bit. And it's important that we know that because Summit's going to try to make it seem like a lot of people are really supportive of the project, and it's simply not true. And if you think about it, if they have, what they're saying up to 20%, that means 80% of people haven't signed, and that's way more important. But one thing we have noticed when we're looking at those easements is that sometimes someone will own a lot of land, and so they've signed away multiple parcels because the pipeline's not 100% sure where it's going to go yet. So they may have 3 pieces of land that they signed for. But in the end, once Summit or Navigator picks their route, they'll only need one of those. So we're not even quite sure if that 20% is misleading or accurate. But either way, more important thing to remember is 80% have it.
And isn't Rassetter one of the landowners?
So from what I've heard, he's not impacted by his own pipeline, from what I understand, but I have heard rumors that he's impacted by the Navigator pipeline. So it'll be interesting to see if he signs an easement.
Do we expect other states to stop the pipelines? Mahmoud, you and so a number of us have been involved. Mahmoud, would you like to answer that question? You've been involved with other states.
Yeah, I believe that we will stop the pipelines. We've got, we came really close with DAPL, and it's actually an illegal pipeline. It's operating without a permit. It has no surety bond in the state of Iowa, which was another requirement. KXL was stopped, largely the last phase of it. And I believe that the public opinion and the tides are changing in our favor on these types of things, especially for stuff like this junk science that's not proven. And we don't want to see another, fracking where we don't know what the consequences of storing tons of CO2 underground are.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add to any intel on other states?
I know from what I'm hearing from landowners and other organizations that are working to stop it is that we have a good chance in a lot of the states. This opposition is just widespread, and it's just pretty incredible to see how many people are really standing up and fighting for their states. It wouldn't surprise me if it's Iowa that helps stop these pipelines, or if it's North Dakota saying no to sequestration, or if it's South Dakota saying you can't pass through our state. It could be any of us, but the most important thing is we all have to fight our hardest, because it's just going to take one of our states to save all of us.
So I'm going to open this up to the entire panel and ask about, are there solutions to climate change? If we are unanimously against this as a climate change solution, what are we for? Anybody like to address that?
I can, Mahmoud, if you want to go. Otherwise, I can kind of kick off just a few of the ideas.
Yeah, I would like to see restoration of prairie on a national scale, all the way from the northern border to the southern border. It would do a lot of things for us, as far as flood control and carbon sequestration, namely. So
absolutely. I think too, we already have a lot of the solutions, right? We just don't have the willpower, the political willpower to enact them on the scale that we need to be seeing. Whether it's wind or solar, there are options out there that don't require any of the dangers on a level like these pipelines do.
Yeah, stop geoengineering. I was a judge for an international tribunal on the rights of nature, that nature itself should have the right to exist. And the kinds of solutions, these geoengineering solutions, the offsets, carbon credits, carbon capture and sequestration were all ruled by that tribunal as false. And what we are for is keep fossil fuels in the ground. That as long as we are propping up the fossil fuel industry with things like ethanol, which is just raising corn for essentially gasoline, these are not going to get us out of the mess that we're in. So we deserve, future generations deserve, nature deserves clean and healthy kinds of solutions to the energy problems that we're facing. We have a lot of solutions. Keeping it in the ground, conservation, energy conservation are all things that we can do now. But first and foremost, it's keep the fossil fuels in the ground, stop burning them, and stop propping up the fossil fuel industry with more and more subsidies. That's my rant for the night. Anybody else want to add anything to that?
I would like to just point out, this seems a lot like during the Obama administration when they were really pushing natural gas as the big solution to the economy and to the climate change and everything because it was supposedly less harmful than CO2. And then it actually turned out to be worse. And, we had gangbusters proliferation of natural gas exploration during that. And we see now the same type of thing with the perverse government incentive through these tax credit. We see this kind of junk science pushed on the people, and they're all kind of bought hook, line, and sinker. A lot of the politicians, bipartisan support, and it's really unfortunate because I think that this is taking away from legitimate alternatives that should be developed at a much faster rate. We should be developing battery technology to aid in solar and wind, and doing different types of wind and doing different types of solar and exploring that and subsidizing those things more, like we had historically been doing to fossil fuels.
Thank you. And so many of you have joined us from various perspectives, whether it's your knowledge and deep desire to stop runaway climate change on behalf of generations to come, or whether it is because you don't want your land ripped off by some private corporation. Whatever your reason was, we are in this together. So Miriam Kasia has asked how this anti-CCS pipeline differs from what we did with DAPL. I think the first is that we learned so many lessons. Miriam, by the way, is with 100 Grannies, which is one of our members of our coalition. And we got a late start when it came to the Dakota Access Pipeline. And what people don't know is that Iowa had a large resistance. Many of you are familiar with what happened at Standing Rock and the massive Indigenous resistance that happened there. We formed alliances with our Indigenous relatives and friends, both in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Iowa, and mounted a significant resistance here. We did not have the same kind of cross sector coalition that we have now. So we have made much more common cause with landowners, and that's been a wonderful experience, a lot of learning that we've had to do together. And one of the reasons for having this particular seminar or webinar was that we wanted to share with you the concerns that went beyond the landowners. So I think in Dakota Access, we prioritized water to some extent, and it was really led by our Indigenous allies. And I think in this one, we have broadened that coalition, and that climate is a big focus for many of us. So lessons learned from a fabulous coalition resisting Dakota Access. And I want to say that struggle is not over. There are still legal efforts that are ongoing, and we are the bulldogs in this. We are going to bite and hang on and shake until these CO2 pipelines go away, just as we're not going to let go of Dakota Access. Does anybody else want to answer that question, fill in anything that I left out about Dakota Access?
I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. The only thing I would add is just the landowner resistance. I think we really learned how important that was from Dakota Access because of Iowa's process. Iowa's process is so heavily determined on eminent domain and the Iowa Utilities Board, and the Iowa Utilities Board considers landowners the most in that process. And so we learned a lot, and the landowners this time are really stepping up and doing some incredible work. And I just want to honor their hard work and everyone else's hard work and echo what you're saying, Carolyn. It's the fact that we're coming together this time.
I think one of you is just the fact that while we've learned a lot, these corporations don't seem to have. They're kind of using the same playbook, and we're 2 steps ahead of them because of what we've already learned.
So if you think that Emma is mistaken on this, Dakota Access is using the same lawyer that Summit is now using the same lawyer as Dakota Access. So apparently they haven't learned their lesson, but we're in this together. And so, as I've looked at why we have joined together with landowners, it's been unique for us to cross so many political edges or, like far apart camps. And we've come together. And the thing that it strikes me in reading, I've read every single objection submitted to the Iowa Utilities Board for all of the pipelines. And what strikes me is that so many people say, we are in this because of a vision about Iowa, that we want to leave Iowa in better shape to future generations. And this is what we share, that we want to leave a healthy land, a healthy state, a healthy set of communities into the future to generations to come. And that's why we banded together. And it's unique in having come together with such different groups. And I think that stands Iowa in good stead. And that crossing of all of those boundaries and those uniting of such different camps is what makes this extraordinary. And that I think gives us its power. We're in this together.
Carolyn, I thought of one other thing too that I think we've learned since Dakota Access. I think we didn't really understand how much destruction happens during pipeline construction. And I think farmers across the state saw, massive ruts in their land, mixing of soil types, compaction that destroyed the land's ability to grow anything or to absorb any water. And the area of the state, like that path along the pipeline route of Dakota Access, you go to Google Earth and zoom in, you can still see the scar across the state. And I think now that we know what happens when they bring in the bulldozers and they bring in all that heavy equipment, I think we are in a different situation. They can't lie to us and say that our land will be returned to the way it was. It's not possible.
It's not possible. We're in this together. Is there anyone that has a last word before we close this out?
I have a screen if anyone does want to contact any of the panelists that have been speaking tonight. I want to show this screen here. You can jot down any email addresses, but these are the speakers. And while anyone else has any final words, I'll leave that screen up.
I just want to add that I did see a question about if folks will have access to this recording. And yes, it is already being broadcast on Facebook. So if you check out our Facebook page, the Iowa Carbon Pipeline Resistance, it's on there. And I'm sure we'll also send it around to everybody that's RSVP'd.
So let me just say that we will be sending you an email if you register. Well, if you're here, you registered for it. We'll send you an email with ways to stay in contact with us and with follow-up information. So we're really grateful that you came tonight, and we're hoping that you'll join us for future webinars that we're going to hold, going into deeper conversation and exploration of the topics that you heard here tonight. So look forward to seeing you in the months to come, and hope to see you on the front lines as we join together to resist this pipeline and win. We will win as long as we're in this together. So thank you very much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. And I want to thank Sherry Seidman, who handled the back end of this webinar. She's just such a fabulous human being, and so generous with her time. And thank each one of the panelists for your wisdom, your insight, and for your humor and grace. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here.